Okay. Now I think I managed to get that.
Start.
Sweet. All right. Thanks, Brendan. So thanks for coming out. This is awesome. I guess the first question is just to gauge where you guys are at in terms of your experience. Who here has never used HTML before? All right, cool. Who here has never used JavaScript before? All right. Who here has never used jQuery before? Okay, that's good. So that gives us a pretty good foundation, honestly, as we explain things. Having something to compare to is kind of nice. And jQuery is the obvious comparison. So if you've done a little bit of jQuery, you've added some functionality to a website before, something dynamic, and when you use Angular, you'll get to see how Angular does things and how it's a lot easier to do those things in Angular and why it's kind of so cool and easy to get up and running and get a cool website going. So, so why do you want to use Angular? So the first thing is because Angular gives you this thing called two-way data mining. And what that really means is it gives you a way to connect the data and what you're doing in your JavaScript with what you see in the HTML page. So again, using jQuery as an example, if you want to change something, you put something in an input field, you want it to show up, then you've got to bind a handler to that input. You've got to do something when that input changes. You've got to then update the element, the content of that element with what you want to put there. It's a lot of work just to get something quick, and Angular kind of gives you that really easily right out of the box. The second thing is scoping. So again, to use jQuery as an example, everything you do is global. So you're binding things to elements with certain classes. You have some JavaScript code. It's all global. It's all available. What Angular gives you is a way to scope your code, and that scoping reflects the HTML that you've got. So if you have some Angular fanciness happening in, kind of inside one block of HTML, maybe you have access to it within that, but you don't have access to it outside of that. And that's really powerful for being able to reuse things in other places and not having to worry about them kind of bumping into each other. And the last thing I kind of mentioned is that Angular has a bunch of magic built into it. As we'll see, it's really easy to get some pretty cool functionality right out of the box. And we'll go over some of the things that Angular just gives you from Angular Library before kind of coding up some ourselves. So, okay, we talked about it a little bit, but I mean, to be more specific, what you see on the page is different than what your JavaScript is doing. And so again, having to manually update the page every time you want to change something is a lot of work. And so this is going to give us that, like I said, out of the box. And so just kind of a diagram of our JavaScript over here and our view over there. Scoping we did. So we'll show a picture, kind of give an example of like what this actually means. But basically, if this is your markup, right, this is actually a representation of something that I think one of the Angular inspectors for Chrome gives you, but it's basically showing all the different scopes you have. So again, if you have something, this is basically saying you have something called name up here in this, you can actually overwrite it and have your own name down here, or you could actually use the same one up there depending on how things are nested. We're actually not going to get into this really much at all in this talk, but it's good to know going forward that there is this concept of like what's available to you in certain places and being able to reuse that in other places. And then you'll also see something called $ scope. And so don't get confused with the general topic of scope. This is something that's specific to Angular. It's basically where we're going to put all the data that we're going to use. And it's important to know that it's called $ scope, and as you use Angular a lot, you'll see a lot of things have the $ in front of them. There's no special meaning. It doesn't mean anything different. It's just a normal JavaScript variable, but they're kind of reserved words for Angular. So when you see something that has a $ in front of it in Angular, you know it's kind of like an Angular library thing, and it's something to just keep in mind, but it doesn't do anything special because of that. We'll have a controller, and what a controller does is a kind of, and this will make more sense as we get into it, but an Angular controller is just where you kind of put that code and allows you to, again, create that scope of all the information, all the JavaScript that you're going to write, and then we're going to use that $ scope object and kind of connect our view to it, and it's what kind of creates that scope environment for us. So it'll make more sense when we do it. Okay, so now let's get started. So we have kind of a default template set up on JS bin, and we're going to pull it up. And if you guys want to pull it up too, you can do that, and we'll all be kind of starting from the same spot.
So this is kind of the URL you'll need. Can paste this so it's bigger in here.
And when you get there, try to type something in. It should give you a message about cloning it down and making it your own, and you want to do that because you're all going to be writing your own stuff. Kind of wait and make sure everybody's...
Does everyone pretty much have it pulled up?
Working? Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. So if you try to do something in there, so if you try to start typing, it should give you a message about slowing it down.
So in general, like this is the thing we'll be kind of working within throughout the night. So you're gonna want to like kind of keep it open or whatever. You don't need to necessarily close it or anything like that. As we kind of move through topics, we'll keep kind of building upon this example.
Yeah. So, is anybody not there? Everyone's good? All right. So, JS bin is pretty cool. I don't know if you guys have used this stuff before, JS bin or Fiddle or some of these other ones, but it's pretty easy to get up and running. So here I just have a little bit of HTML and a tiny bit of CSS to show that we're going to build this to-do list. We're going to want to be able to add things to the to-do list. We're going to want to check them off, and we're going to want to know, how many of our to-dos we have completed. Right now, this is all just kind of static markup, but we're going to add all this functionality kind of one step at a time. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually add Angular, which is pretty important. So JS bin makes it really nice, but this isn't too hard to figure out. You can just add library. And here I'm just going to add Angular 1.4. And so obviously you can grab this script tag yourself, or you can add the library, and that'll just add the JavaScript there. Just if you guys have any problems following along, raise your hand and someone will come by and help you. So that adds the JavaScript that we'll need. And so Angular is now available. And there's a couple things we need to do just to get set up. The first of which is actually create an Angular application, which is pretty easy. So the way we do that is with this module command. And we just created an Angular app. Doesn't do anything, but we just made one. The syntax is actually important. So this indicates that I'm actually creating the application. If I did not have this empty array, this would actually be referencing an existing application, and it would bark at you when you try to run it because it doesn't exist yet. So there is no application called to-do app. Bigger? Yeah. Is that better? It's going to be kind of crunch, but we'll try to do this kind of one at a time and make that easier. So we just created an Angular app, which is awesome. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to add that Angular app to our page. And this is pretty straightforward. Up here in the HTML, there's this thing called ng app. And that adds our Angular app to the page. So even with the JavaScript there, it wouldn't do anything unless we did this. We'll get to this in a little bit, but this ng app is called a directive, and we'll talk about those more. There's a lot of directives in Angular. We'll get to that. But for now, we know that we need to add that here. The next thing we want to do is basically we want to create this controller we talked about that's going to give us this scope object that we're going to use for our JavaScript. So the way that we do that is to just basically add it to our application. If we can type.
does this syntax kind of make sense to everyone as far as like the dot controller? That's sort of like a JavaScript thing. So I'm not familiar with this. So like just the fact that we do like Angular.module, and the next line we say dot controller, like why that works. So in general, you don't end a line with the semicolon. You start one with a dot, and the next you're kind of calling that line before. If you guys ever work in Ruby, it's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah, it's chaining the module function with the controller.
Yeah, I mean, we could do the same thing like this, right? So if I just created that app and then I just said, okay, app.controller, it's the same thing. Maybe that makes more sense.
You actually use a line break after the last parenthesis.
After here?
Controller, do you have a line break?
Right now? I mean, before or?
Before.
I had it on the next line. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't matter. And kind of similar to the app, we need to add this controller to the page so it knows where to go. So basically, we're going to put it down here in the body. Everything is going to be in this controller. And again, we'll talk about these things in a little bit. Okay, so now I just added that controller, and that's going to give us this kind of scope of where our code is going to live and what it has access to. And in this case, it's everything in the body is going to have access to our code.
So you always use double quotation in HTML and single quotation.
Yeah, I that's something that it's a convention that I generally do. It depends. I mean, I guess maybe it comes from Ruby too, but like when I'm not interpolating, in JavaScript, I'll generally use single quotes. It's a Ruby thing, maybe, I don't know. In an HTML, I typically will always use double.
It's really convention. It
Yeah.
break anything.
No, it wouldn't. It shouldn't make a difference. Okay, so this is kind of boring stuff so far. Let's do something cool. We want to see some of this dynamic kind of two-way binding sort of stuff. So this scope that we talked about is basically where we're going to put everything, and it's basically everything that we put on the scope here. Our HTML over here inside of this has access to that. Okay, so if I wanted to, let's say, I want to actually know how many to-dos I actually have. So first of all, let's make kind of an array of to-dos, right? And this is, again, a lot of this is just plain JavaScript. So I have some to-dos. I want to see kind of how many to-dos I have actually on this page. So because I'm within kind of where this controller is, I have access to everything on the scope. And the way that I reference it is to do this kind of double curlies. So anything I put in there is going to get interpolated by Angular, and it's going to sub in things from the scope. So instead of having that 3 there, I can just put to-dos.length. And so now, and of course that's 0. If I added something here, now it's 1. So that was kind of magical because JS been refreshed, but I can turn that off actually. But basically, if I run it, I see I have 1 to-do. Now I have 2 to-dos. So that's pretty cool. We didn't do much. We didn't have to bind a bunch of handlers for things or anything like that. I just put some JavaScript here and I made some to-dos and I just get to reference it here and Angular does the rest for us. That's pretty cool.
That scope variable, that just says global always.
So the scope is not global. So the scope here refers to this scope is available inside of this controller. And this controller here is available inside the body. Okay, so as an example, so let's say I did this. Okay, so now this controller really only is available here in this div. Everything in that controller, nothing in that controller is available outside of that div. So now it breaks, right? It doesn't know. That's what it should do. There's nothing there. There's no scope that's available to the HTML there. So it's got to be inside of that controller. Does that make sense? seeing some confused looks. But this has to do with kind of the scope that we're talking about. So again, if I were to put something inside of here, oops, and if I could spell correctly, okay, then I'm going to see it. So it's got to be that it applies to the markup, your HTML. So everything inside of there is going to be available.
So one challenge in general with Angular is like it's sort of you're kind of adding it to existing HTML.
Right.
So the HTML has to be kind of structured in a way that like the scope would be defined properly. So in this case, like you want to put the ng controller on the body so we get access to everything in the body. Versus like in this case where we have it just on this div, you're not necessarily going to have access to everything. So there is some kind of knowing the HTML structure in general of your layout. The scope of your right?
Oh, here? This is just an array of things. So
So how is that changing? How is that accessing the?
that's the magic.
That's the magic.
So what Angular does, right? So it says, okay, I created this controller here. So again, everything, this controller kind of applies to everything within those two tags, right? Inside that div. And I have some JavaScript here. It's basically looking and it basically does like a processing of your HTML before it shows up on the page. And it looks for things and then replaces them, right? So basically, when it gets here, it says, okay, I've got this to-do controller that handles things inside of here. It's basically going to look and say, oh, double curlies? I know that's where I put stuff in. And so I put in, and then I said to-dos. Well, it knows in that controller I have this scope, and on the scope I have something called to-dos. So it's going to basically replace to-dos here with this to-dos, and then .length is just .length is just JavaScript. So this is when I say there's magic. That's the magic, right? Because in jQuery you'd have to do something like you grab the element and you'd set the content or you set the inner HTML or something like that. That's actually what it's doing. It's just setting up this process of going through the HTML, seeing where I need to stick stuff in, and doing it for you. And so again, like it's a little magical, and you'll see as we continue that it adds magic as we go. So I'm going to back this out, and so now, sorry.
Basically, you can kind of look at those squigglies as being like you're inside of Angular world.
That's right.
So when you're in HTML and you do squigglies, you have access to writing, like your Angular in there.
Yep. Anytime it sees those double squigglies, it's going to look for things on the scope of that area, right? Of whatever scope applies to that area, it's going to look for that. And you can actually, and this is, it's probably not something we're going to go over, but you can actually do something very cool in that, oh my God. You can actually get at some of this stuff just in the terminal or in the console here.
So, and if you don't know how to load console, you can in Chrome. It's a Chrome plug, or it's a Chrome extension thing, or just comes with Chrome. But
Yeah, I do Command Option J to open the console, but you can also, let's say, if you like right-clicked over here, you have a double right-click, and you get to inspect element. That'll generally bring up the same thing, the console.
And then you have to get the console.
Yeah, so I would go here. But you can actually, I don't have jQuery here, so just for the moment I'm going to add jQuery, so this will work. A lot of times you'll have jQuery. Where's my jQuery? So you can do something kind of magical in here. And I'm not going to go in detail, but maybe it won't.
Because bodies, right?
I need to write JS bin console.
Do what?
Oh yeah, there's a
JS
console
console.
tab on JS.
Let's see if Angular is there. Okay, that's better. Good thinking. So if you were normal, if you just had your console, But you can do something pretty cool where you can actually see what's there in the scope just from here. And so basically, if I were to go scope.todos, I can actually see those to-dos. So it's, again, this is kind of like a debugging thing as you go forward, but you can actually get at the information that's in your Angular stuff by kind of pulling out that element from the HTML, and it knows, it has that scope that's kind of bound to it. It knows what data is there, which is probably a little more than I was going to show, but it's okay. So we did this kind of cool thing with the to-dos. We're showing that we've got so many to-dos here. I'm going to get rid of jQuery for now. So your task in the next few minutes is to basically personalize your to-do list. So using what you've learned here about kind of creating something on the scope and then accessing it on the scope, using the double curlies, what I'd like to see is you put your name in front of to-do list right here. And we'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. Using Angular, not HTML, not jQuery. So don't just put in, Dave's to-do list. That doesn't count.
No CSS too well.
No before, after, none of that fanciness. You're going to do it in Angular, and we'll kind of walk around and help you.
Interlude? Yeah. Let me, how did we stop the recording before?
There's a thing at the top, and I forget too many.
Oh, there it is.